So I want to introduce three great friends and scientists, Professor Nancy Kanosher, Professor Thomas Sir, and Professor Josh Tenenbaum. We're going to conduct this in a similar fashion to our panel on Monday. So each of the panelists will have a very short answer to this question first, and then they will initiate the conversation and the dialogue with all of you. So without further ado, thanks again, Nancy, Thomas, and Josh for participating here. And the podium is all yours now.
So I thought I'd just start with a couple minutes on my immediate take on this question, and then we can get lots of other perspectives in your questions. So starting with the question of what is the relationship between biological brains and AI, it strikes me that really we need to ask the relationship at what level. And what I'm referring to is Marr's levels of analysis, which probably many of you already know about, but in case you don't, Marr made the very important point that when we want to understand a complex system like a brain, it's very helpful to think of the question of how it works at three different levels. The computational theory, which really considers the nature of the problem that it solves. What are the inputs? What are the outputs? Could you get those outputs from those inputs? Is it an ill-posed problem? That kind of thing. The actual series of computations that happen, step-by-step computations, the algorithm that runs, the representations that are extracted, as at a second level. And the third level is the actual physical hardware of the system. So I think if we think of this question at these three levels, my perhaps idiosyncratic take on this focused overly on trying to understand brains by using AI, is that at the level of computational theory, really the questions are the same. The whole point of computational theory is it's characterizing the problem to be solved. And it doesn't matter if that problem is being solved by a human brain or an insect or a deep net. But so by definition, the computational theory of a given task or problem is the same for all these systems. But that enables us to ask this cool question, which is, when an AI system and a brain does the same task, will they necessarily be running similar algorithms, or when will they be running similar algorithms? And so then you can ask at this level of the algorithm representation level, we can ask, well, okay, are they running similar algorithms? And the cool thing about that is now a really tractable, in some cases, empirical question. So we have all these nice methods now. We can compare representations in brains and representations in deep nets using representational similarity analysis or regression methods or lots of things you've probably heard about in previous lectures to ask how similar are these things. And there are already some really impressive findings, like the paper that I'm sure Jim DiCarlo told you about, the Yeamans and DiCarlo 2014 paper, showing that when you train deep nets to do visual object recognition tasks, you find a remarkable similarity, to the degree of different levels of the deep net corresponding to different stages of processing in the primate brain. And that's quite astonishing. It very much didn't have to be that the deep net and the brain would come up with at least somewhat similar kind of strategies for visual recognition. I think this is a really important paper. But it's not just vision where we see this. Josh McDermott's lab has been looking at optimized solutions in deep nets for auditory perception problems like speech and music, and also finding similarities to brains. And in a paper that from Ed Fedorenko's lab that Josh is also involved in, they've been looking at natural language processing models optimized just for doing various language prediction tasks and finding a remarkable match between the behavior of the representations in those systems and the brain's response to language. So in at least some cases, it seems like there is a real similarity here. And of course, those systems don't match perfectly. Okay, this is more than 1 minute, but I'm not going to be much longer. They don't match perfectly, but that's not a problem. That's an opportunity. It tells us, okay, there's a mismatch here. There's something different. And that starts to give us clues about how to think about how they differ, how to make them more similar, et cetera. And then at the level of hardware, well, obviously AI systems and brains are totally different in many ways at the level of hardware. But now, is that a problem? Does that mean that these systems are not useful? Well, no, I think it's actually a strength in many ways. if you find that despite this very different kind of hardware between, say, a deep net and a brain solving a similar problem, if you find nonetheless that the representations involved are very similar, that tells you that actually for this set of computations, or this solving this problem, maybe the hardware doesn't matter. Or sorry, if they're different, maybe it says they do matter. And if they're similar, maybe it says that you can get the very same, or very similar algorithms running despite very different hardware. And I think that's a really deep idea. And I think that's really the idea that Marr was talking about, or a version of it, when he said, and now my screen is occluded, it's just a minute, he said, the nature of the computations that underlie perception depends more on the computational problem than on the particular hardware in which their solutions are implemented. So I think, the translation to kind of modern AI modeling here is that an AI system optimized for doing a given task will necessarily have some similarity in how it approaches that task to how brains approach it. And I think AI systems enable us to test that very interesting hypothesis. Okay, I talked too long. I'm done now.
I would agree with almost everything I think Nancy said. I could add a couple of remarks maybe, and then if you want to go, Thomas, and then we could just all go to
Not that you need to respond to that. That was just what I had to say.
No, I would know. Yeah. I mean, I share a lot of those basic ideas. I guess I would just say that, I think maybe implicit in what you were saying, Nancy, was, you pointed to 3 examples of AI models, which are all a certain class of deep neural networks. And I think implicit, or maybe even explicit, is that what makes these models particularly exciting is that there's some architectural and maybe kind of, circuit level motifs that they have in common with the brain. That's certainly true in the ventral stream models for the Yeomans, DiCarlo et al. Models, and maybe in the McDermott models for auditory cortex. But like the work with Martin Shrimpf and Ev Fedorenko in language models, which Nancy is also part of. Both she and I are very small parts of that bigger collaboration.
I'm the cheerleading section for that project.
Well, okay. But anyway, so they're just, I don't know if anybody's going to talk about that work, but you can, if in case nobody does, you can read that paper on bioRxiv or a version of it. But that's a really interesting kind of challenging case, because what we show there is that the kind of predictive neural language models that have been all the rage in NLP, specifically the GPT-2 class of models, which are these generative pre-trained transformers from OpenAI, provide really remarkably good models of the language processing in the human brain in terms of being able to explain variance in fMRI and ECOG signals, ECOG being intracranial recordings in humans. Okay, so that's very cool. But as a number of people have pointed out, and for those, probably somebody will talk about these class of transformer models for language if they haven't already in the summer school. Many of you might know about them. But the relation between what goes on there in terms of the, quote, neurons of the neural network and what goes on in neurons in the brain is much less clear, right? Mm-hmm. Many people would say they're obviously not like what the brain is doing. You can call them units in a neural network, but the way the architecture works is obviously different from the brain. To me, I don't think it's so obvious. It's just not so clear, right? So it just raises open questions like how brain-like are these models? Or maybe they raise questions that we don't really, I would say, and I think Thomas might comment on this too. I know he's worked on this. We have a certain kind of canonical standard model of what neurons do and what networks of neurons do in the brain and how that plays out in math. But that is by no means true necessarily. We don't know that that's what neural computation is really like. There could be all sorts of aspects of neural computation that standard model doesn't take into account, whether it has to do with what goes on inside dendrites or in the temporal properties of how networks of neurons fire together, or just other aspects of neural computation that we don't know. And maybe the fact that these models, let's say these very large transformer models, which some would say don't look like what the brain does, maybe there is a sense that they are more like what the brain does. And I'm not saying we know that. I'm just saying we should be asking those questions. And then beyond that, I would say, and the people who don't know the work that I do will see more of this when I present on Friday. But there's important aspects of cognition, to me, many of the most important, that there are no neural network models of at this point. There are other kinds of AI models that involve symbolic and probabilistic generative models defined on symbolic representations, which fit very well what the brain does at the software level, but we don't understand, and they predict behavior very well, and they perform very well in an AI setting, better than neural network models, but we don't know how they could be implemented in neural network terms. The brain is a neural network, and they work, if we think they're right, they work in the brain, but then that it's just coming from a different direction, raising this question that we still don't know how key aspects of computation, like a representation of an object or a symbol of a concept, we don't know how those things are represented in the brain. So to me, that's just a big open question, right? We can capture those. We're making progress on certain kinds of things on the AI side, but not in neural network form. So it raises the question of what those look like in the brain's neural networks.
Yeah, so I agree with obviously what Nancy and Josh have said. Maybe if I had to expand a little bit on one aspect, I would, my view on the relationship between biological brains and AI is relatively complex. And I think if we look at the history and the path that neuroscience and AI have followed, there has been some point where AI and cybernetics somewhat joined forces with neuroscience, and there has been times where the two have diverged. So I think that the question is still worth asking. I think part of the answer will depend on the essentially the goal or goals. So I think as a neuroscientist, it seems impossible for us to understand the brain without any form of mathematical theory or AI as a guideline and a way to formalize a question to be asked about brains. So to me, there is no question that neuroscience cannot proceed without AI and computer science and math. I think the reverse is not necessarily true. I think it's possible that AI will mostly diverge from neuroscience, and that's probably okay. But I think this is one of the points I think we're going to get back to. Someone was asking about other forms of intelligence. The challenge we have, I think, here is that, at least to my knowledge, I was trying to come up with an alternative form of intelligence beside brains, and I couldn't come up with any, because I think grounded in the idea of artificial intelligence is biological-like intelligence as a goal. And so it could be that the two are so intertwined that ultimately AI will have to follow somewhat of a biological path. And as Nancy pointed out, there is already overlap, obviously, complete overlap at the computational level. There's partial overlap and potentially interesting differences at the algorithmic level. And so the question will be, how much overlap will we ultimately end up with towards AGI?
What do you think about the role of inductive biases in ANNs based on brain architectures? I mean, it seems, this is from Miguel Nunez. I mean, it seems that the architecture of a CNN is closely related with the architecture of the visual perceptual stream, and those models have fairly good performance in visual tasks. But do you think we should be looking in those inductive biases to produce new models? So meaning, like, should we be looking for the brain to give new inductive biases for ANNs? Or I guess we could also be looking at inductive biases that have proven valuable in ANNs and see if those are in the brain. But it sounds like it's going more from the brain to providing inductive biases for ANNs.
Yeah, so I like this question a lot. And I think, I think we can all agree that, very wide, very deep feed-forward neural networks are universal approximators. So with enough units and enough training data, they'll be able to learn any arbitrary input to output mapping. So in theory, there's no visual. So I mean vision, by the way. So when I speak of AI, everything should be taken with a grain of salt, and you should replace AI by vision, because this is really all I know. But so going back to our feed-forward neural networks, there is no task that they wouldn't be able to learn. and so I guess
wait, I have to interrupt. Do you mean no classification task? Or, I mean, there's lots of visual tasks that are very subtle and sophisticated, and that the kind of thing that Josh studies.
You just mean like a universal approximator. You're saying there's no like function approximation task.
Right. So I guess it's hard for me to think of a task that wouldn't be formalizable as an input to output mapping. Now, this is what I would also refer to as the brute force approach. And I think, to me, what's really fascinating about brains is their ability to learn so efficiently. And so, in that sense, I think about, and Josh was talking about transformers early on. If we take a black box, very deep neural network, there is no necessarily something like attention. There is not something maybe explicit as working memory. There is not necessarily something as explicit as, saccadic system and so on and so forth. And so what becomes interesting is whether, and we know that many of those tasks potentially require some form of memory, some form of attention, at least as we've studied it from the neuroscience perspective. And so to me, what's fascinating is whether when we train those deep neural networks, those functions or those neural computation will emerge spontaneously. And perhaps if we had, enough samples and enough, human-like or biological-like visual type of diets or experiences, maybe they would. But it's very likely that given the ecologically invalid ways in which we train those networks, it's unlikely that those functions will arise just through training. And so I think, going back to the question by Miguel, I think this is one potentially interesting involvement of neuroscience, in that some of those functions that we know are relevant, at least from the biological perspective for solving those tasks, can potentially be thought as inductive biases. And it's very likely that if we want those networks to solve tasks much more efficiently, and in particular learn to solve novel tasks much more efficiently, those types of function will certainly, those functions that I think of as the building blocks of neural computation, will become quite useful. Now, again, not to say that this is the only games in town, but this is certainly one solution that we know works, at least for biology.
Yeah. But I'd just add that, there are lots of different kinds of things that we might mean by inductive biases, and lots of different kinds of things would end up being biased. But here's another example. You mentioned attention and working memory and stuff like that. But in my lab, my postdoc, Katerina Dobbs, has been looking at this question of why human brains have functional specialization at all. Yeah, sorry?
Hey, Nancy, someone has a really good question, which is on the chat. Can someone please define inductive bias? I think we just skipped over that.
Yeah.
You want to, basically we mean something like in a learning system, something you do that biases the function that is learned in a certain way that isn't just in the data. So it could be like the architecture, or it could be a prior if you're a Bayesian. It could be some pre-training on a different data set that isn't the thing that you think you are learning on for this task. Those are the kinds of things.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so the case I'm talking about here is like...
Or some extra loss function, smoothness criterion. Yeah, okay, good.
Yep, yep. So, brains have specialized regions for face processing. I and lots of other people have been studying this for a long time. The question is, why do they have them and how do they arise? And it's very tempting to say, look, this is an important thing. It's been important throughout human evolution. Maybe you have to build in something, a special learning mechanism. You have to do something which you might call an inductive bias, something that you build in to make the system set that up. So what Katerina finds is when she trains VGG on both face recognition and object recognition tasks, it manages to learn both tasks well. But when you look inside, you see that what it has done is spontaneously segregate the network, increasingly at later stages, into basically a face processing pathway and an object processing pathway. So lots of people, formerly including me, who might have thought, look, if you have these separate systems in adult brains, there must be some bias that tells the brain to treat them separately. What this suggests that, in principle at least, it's possible that a very generic learning system that learns to categorize is going to spontaneously segregate its machinery. So I think there are many versions of this question, but one kind of thing that you might have thought would require an inductive bias maybe doesn't.
I think there are other cases. Yeah, I mean, yeah, other kinds of inductive biases that where we, by studying the brain, gain insight for AI models. I mean, I think I can point to two. One is that several other people have already asked about in the Q&A. You know, I guess what you could call either feedback or recurrence or top-down connections. Those aren't the same things, but they're sort of related. It's things that are not just a feed-forward classifier, basically. And you know, I think that we are far from understanding how that works in the brain. We know there's a lot of top-down connections. We know in various ways that feedback and recurrence is important, leads to better models both functionally and physiologically. And you know, I mean, I think AI people sort of figured that out too. I don't know that they necessarily were inspired by the brain, but there's all sorts of ways in which, you know, by incorporating it could be either by incorporating, for example, generative models in the loop for a vision system, or by having recurrent things. For example, an architecture that Jiajun Wu and colleagues, I was one of them, had a couple of years ago. It was a neural net that learns to go from 2D images to 3D volumetric reconstructions. It was called MARNet, named after the same Mar that Nancy was talking about. And in the spirit of Mar, it had a kind of intermediate representation of what Mar called the 2.5D sketch, but like a in between a 2D image and a 3D volumetric reconstruction, it had something like a map of surface normals. And that by putting that in there, that inductive bias, it made the system better at 3D reconstruction, but also there were feedback connections in which the 3D volume was forced to produce a 3D shape whose visible surfaces were compatible with an estimate of the surface normals, and that loop made the system better also. So that's an example of something that to us was inspired from the biological side and helped to make the system better. And one other example, which comes from behavioral studies, is the idea of objects, right? So again, you'll hear more about this probably in other parts of the summer school, and certainly in my lecture on Friday. But the idea that from very early age, even babies who are just a couple of months old, if not much younger, see the world not just in terms of patterns in pixels, but actually physical objects. Like we sometimes talk about in object permanence, but like a thing, right? Like even if you've never seen a glasses case before, you know what this is. Like I'm holding a thing and it's in one hand and now I've tossed it to the other hand. And when I drop it, it goes out of sight of the screen, but you know it's still there. It didn't just disappear, right? Or I can put it behind my head and it's going to still be there, and there it is again. Okay, so the idea that the world is made of objects like that, this is different from how we recognize objects and classify them, which is a lot of what we were talking about before. But the idea that the world is made of objects, that seems to be something that humans and many other brains are built with. And on the AI side, taking neural networks and making them object-centric, where basically they analyze complex scenes or physical dynamics, not just holistically, but by having separate representations of the objects and their interactions, has made them much better. And it was definitely inspired by our understanding of the object-centric nature of human scene understanding and intuitive physics. So that's, I think, another great place where biology influenced AI, but it wasn't via the architecture, because we still don't know how those object representations work in biological neurons. Rather, it was based on behavioral studies and computational cognitive models, which elucidated the importance of those representations. And then that's what the AI was building on.
Yeah, I mean, to me, what following up on Josh, to me, the real question is whether these inductive biases need to be kind of baked in, or somewhat they would be discovered with the proper kind of visual diet, right? So one of the issues that I see in modern AI, especially in vision, is we know that CNNs trained on ImageNet learn mostly textures, whether it's texture of the objects, the background. And to some extent, it's not surprising, given that they are trained on IID samples, independent images, and so on and so forth. There is very little information besides statistical regularities that can be learned by these architectures. And in particular, for the case of foreground versus background, the only way these networks would be able to properly learn a model for the foreground versus background would be if the foreground and background were independent. That is, that objects would appear on a completely independent background, And we know that's not the case. We know that objects are, especially on the internet, images are presented in context. And so there is no way in the world that these networks would be able to learn any kind of notion of object based on the images that are used to train them. So one option, as you pointed out, Josh, would be that, yeah, maybe we can just bake in an explicit representation and the sense of objects.
Yeah.
But, babies also learn very differently. And we know that there are, babies learn in a much richer visual environments. Babies have access to stereo, disparate information. We know that motion information gives a amazing cue for foreground versus background, right? In fact, even work by Pavan Sinha at MIT has shown that adult patients who have recently recovered from impaired vision seem to be recovering primarily the ability to recognize moving objects as opposed to static objects. And the assumption is that has to do with the fact that moving objects are much easier to segment out from their background. And so I guess to me, the interesting question, and I know that there's a lot of work in this area, a lot of work motivated and arising from developmental cognitive science labs with more realistic data sets involving maybe video sequences of either object manipulation or observers embedded in the environment, maybe even stereo. That to me will become an interesting kind of test bed to study how those networks are able to, whether they do learn some of those inductive biases from data, because those biases are inherently in the data, or whether they need additional kind of help, whether it's the evolution that our brains had or any kind of,
I mean, what I love about this is that deep nets give us a kind of empirical way to test, in principle, what you have to build in to learn something, right? So when I was in grad school, Chomsky was carrying on about the poverty of the stimulus, and everybody believed him because Chomsky posited it. Chomsky said, okay, there's not enough information there to extract the unique syntax of your language, therefore there must be stuff that's innate. Everybody said, okay, Chomsky says true, end of story. But now that has become an empirical question. You can train deep nets on different kinds of inputs with different kinds of architecture and ask the question of what those things can learn. And people like Tal Linzen and others are doing this kind of stuff.
But
right?
Nancy, I mean, I know you're in love with deep nets and it's great, but but like that's also true for just machine learning in general. People have been doing that for decades. And
I think the difference that it didn't used to work. I think that's the difference.
That's a lie. That's a lie. Sorry.
Well,
I mean that's ridiculous.
It didn't used to work as well.
Well, certain things didn't used to work as well. Certain things work much
Certainly
better.
Language processing. I mean, language processing, Josh. I mean, like 10 years ago, language processing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I think that it's just important for people to understand that there are certain kinds of. I mean, there are certain kinds of things in language processing. I wasn't planning to talk about language processing, but I gave a keynote at this year's ACL conference, which talks about this. There's certain aspects of language processing which models like GPT-2 do better than anything. But there are other aspects of language processing that engage more with meaning, and where you have to understand like the content of verbs and how they ground in perception. That our best models don't involve. I mean, they might use neural networks in some ways, but they're not the GPT class of models. They're ones where key things are done by other technologies that existed well before. So this isn't a language panel, so I'm not going to go into it here. But I just think it is important for students who are new, and especially given that there's a strong vision focus in this group at CBMM, that there's a lot of things in intelligence and AI besides vision and visual object recognition, and a lot of ways to ask those questions. So anyway,
yeah, I mean, my point was just that if you have a system where you have an opportunity to use kind of brute force training from a big diet of input, it enables you now to ask for at least that set of systems whether it is ever possible to learn X from input Y, and that's cool. Like it used to be just speculation before, now it's something that you can ask.
Sure, but I'm not just trying to stand up for other machine learning methods. It's just that if those systems, there are some things those systems just don't learn. Like they don't, I mean, the neural language models you're talking about, they don't actually reason. They don't form a semantic representation, okay? They form some kind of statistical summary of a semantic representation, but like they don't understand the concept of negation. I was just playing with GPT-3 earlier today. And so, no, but it's just don't, like they're not, it would be a false, you don't want to be constrained. Like maybe what I'm trying to say is the point you're making is even more powerful than I think you're casting it as. Because if you want to ask what can be learned from data versus has to be built in, then you should just be willing to like, you should recognize that there's ways of learning and things from data that deep networks are not very good at, but other methods are good at. And so it's important to be able to ask those questions with the full tool set and not just be constrained to one of them. Okay.
Yeah.
So there were a few questions that were in here, and we could spend the entire time just talking about one thing. But well, let's see. So okay, so one has now when I glanced a minute ago, well, the order has changed, but let's go with the one that's on top if that's good for people.
Yep.
The biological brain can perform this is from Carolyn Malin Mayer. The biological brain can perform an incredibly large number of tasks, while current neural networks are often trained for one or two specific purposes. How close or far to the biological brain is the idea of creating separate networks for separate tasks and linking them with some sort of scheduler? How can we take inspiration from biology to make an artificial system that can perform many different tasks? Good question.
Yes. Well, by task, Caroline, I don't know whether you meant, so you mean task, very general tasks spanning multiple modalities, or within a modality, say different visual tasks? Because I think the answer might be slightly different. Yeah, I mean, I would say for the visual system, there's clearly one visual system and one neural networks, right? So there are different streams, there are different, subtle, but it's hard for me to imagine. And I think that's probably one of the issues we've had in the field, is that we've been separating all of these different visual recognition problems somewhat separately, and both from a neuroscience and from a computer vision perspective. And clearly we have one visual system that is capable to solve almost any random or arbitrary task that we throw at it. And Josh had those amazing experiments from early experiments that were conducted in his lab, showing how quickly people can learn novel object categories, for instance. And that's in sharp contrast with even right.
Okay, visual tasks, segmentation, classification, but now I'm curious about both. But Thomas, I want to take issue with that. I think, yeah, sure, there's one visual system, but it's the whole back third of the head, right? And if you look at it, there's lots of different bits that are doing wildly different things. Like processing visual motion is just a very different kind of computation from extracting the shape of objects. And it turns out empirically, if you look at it in human brains, and if you look at it in deep nets trained on lots of things, face recognition turns out to be just a very different task from object recognition. And so I think that actually both in the structure of the task itself and in the organization of the brain, and I'm guessing in the structure of any system that's going to be able to do really sophisticated vision, you're going to find quite a striking degree of segregation of function where different parts of the network are going to be specialized for different aspects of the task. I don't know if you're disagreeing with that.
Okay,
or...
So, no, I do agree, and maybe I should have been clear. Segregation of functions to me is not incompatible with the fact that those algorithms run essentially more or less the same neural computations. And I think what's at least squinting our eyes on the rough architecture of the visual system, you'll find that whether you look at the ventral stream for shape processing or the dorsal stream for motion processing, almost anywhere you look in the visual system, you'll find at least coarse anatomical and functional hierarchy. If you look at the mechanisms that have been discovered in the past 50 years, again, across streams, across tasks, a lot of it boils down to some form of a linear, nonlinear model of a neuron. There will be some form of divisive normalization. There's a lot of overlap between the models involved in motion processing, stereo processing, and contrast processing. Again, that is not to say that we have fully understood those functions. That doesn't say that we've solved the problems. But I wouldn't be surprised if we find that there is a small number of canonical operations that serves similar goals and importance across tasks and functions.
Seems like there's a difference in levels here, right? At the level of, what is a nonlinear function computed by some unit in a neuron or a network, a unit in a deep net. That's one level of computation. And sure, at that level, they're probably shared across lots of things. Neurons are basically neurons, right? They differ in various ways, but they're very similar to one another. But the representations extracted in a motion processing system and a shape system and an intuitive physics system, these are just qualitatively very different. So when we talk about same computations, we need a little more precision about the kind of levels issue here.
Yeah, and again, I think you're bringing an excellent point, and I didn't want to trivialize it by stating that it's all going to be linear filtering followed by rectification and normalization. I think again, if you look at the both from a computational and a kind of an algorithmic level, especially in motion and stereo, to me, it has always been fascinating to realize how much overlap there is between the models. At the end of the day, whether you're trying to solve the stereo correspondence, most of those problems are correspondence problems, whether it's finding correspondence in time or correspondences between, retinal inputs. And so again, not to say I agree with you. I don't want to, trivialize and say that, that all there is to vision is, 3 computations. But again, I think we might superficially underestimate the amount of overlap there is between visual recognition tasks. A lot of it is measuring similarities. And I hope we'll go back to that because I'll contradict myself probably 15 minutes from now by arguing that there is much more than similarity and template matching to vision. But at least for low and mid-level vision, I think a lot of it will find is based on a small set of canonical circuits that solve computationally very similar tasks, that run very similar algorithms, that yes might be carried in separate streams. But to me, that's
I think that the correspondence. The correspondence problem in both motion and stereo was a particularly interesting one to me because those are the 2 things that are computed in visual motion area MT. It does both of those things. And I've often thought that was so interesting. Is that because they're both correspondence problems, albeit very different ones? I don't know the answer to that. Right.
That's true. That's a good point. Yeah.
I think
so. You're arguing, I mean, yeah. So I think, yeah. Sorry. Go ahead, Josh.
No. Go ahead. I was going to go back to the question, but no. I mean, well, I think it's that the word task means so many different things. Well, the question just went away, but a different question got upvoted beyond it. But sorry. But when Caroline says the biological brain can perform an incredibly large number of quote tasks. Yeah, I mean, I guess I can't help but thinking about different kinds of cognitive tasks. Or then when you say how close or far to the brain is the idea of creating separate networks for separate tasks and linking them with some sort of scheduler. Yeah, I mean, I think that the notion of task is sort of a machine learning construction, right? It's a very important idea in machine learning. A task is defined usually by a data set and a loss function and a training and testing regime. But a lot of what human cognition doesn't really fit into that, right? We solve problems, we have goals. Those are kind of like tasks, but often we don't learn them. We make them up or somebody suggests them, right? Many of the tasks that I perform because somebody asked me to perform them or suggested I might, or maybe they didn't, I just thought about it, right? So, I could set myself the task of cleaning up my yard, or I could set myself the task of seeing if I could dig a really deep hole in my backyard. I don't know why I want to do that, but somebody might do that, right? Or seeing, how many small holes could I dig in my backyard? I mean, it's too hot right now to do any of those things, but those are, like I can do that though. If I said, okay, well, I've decided to see how many holes I can dig in one day in my backyard, I could set that task for myself, and somehow I would compose together various perception, action, planning capabilities in order to achieve it. So I think it's really very interesting to try to understand how brains are able to compose together the different things that they have learned how to do a really quite endless open-ended set of what Chomsky I think very rightly called the infinite use of finite means, not just in language but in behavior more generally. I think that, you know, neural networks or any kind of machine learning approach has not really taken us very far to understanding how the brain is able to do that. Maybe we could go to the question, the one that's upvoted
Let's
now.
go to Sharon Chen's question. It's a good question.
Yeah, that looks great. So Sharon says, just like how neural networks are trained analogously to how humans are educated throughout their lifetime, can training of neural networks mimic evolution? What are some strategies that have been used to mimic this evolution to build in inductive biases? And then there's a clarifying remark from Sharon, isn't a goal of AI to be able to learn some form of intelligence from nothing? Okay, yeah, so what do you guys think?
Well, let's take the first clause. Just like how neural networks are trained analogously to how humans are educated throughout their lifetime, I think a lot of us here would sort of disagree with that. At least the standard current, you know, supervised training with millions of labeled
Yeah, we
examples.
might say that today's neural network learning is more like actually like evolution, right?
Exactly.
I mean, when pressed, a lot of people who use neural networks to study where inductive biases come from and to try to learn something from nothing would say that it's maybe more like evolution than it is like biological learning. Maybe not so much in vision, but especially like when people are doing deep reinforcement learning, a lot of those kinds of things are even almost explicitly evolutionary in that you create lots of agents, they sort of all go in different directions, then you see what was the best, and you kind of create a new generation of agents, and you do that many times over, for example. That's not necessarily the way people approach like deep learning in vision, but a lot of the ways that people have tried to use AI learning systems to learn something from nothing have looked at least as much like evolution as like learning, as like what biologists would call learning.
And what do you guys think about these new unsupervised models, like the recent Yamins paper, which suggests that you can get a lot of the same performance in visual recognition using much more generic learning rules, like basically just trying to.
Well, you mean like self-supervised contrastive losses? You mean like like more?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, there's.
I mean, it seems
so,
at least a little bit. Well, it just seems a little bit closer to the kind of learning regime of infants, right? Where not every damn thing has to be labeled, right? Yeah. Yeah.
But you know, we were just talking about task. I think so. So again, I think this is fascinating, and again, I you know, this goes way beyond anything that I would have imagined if you had asked me just a few years ago. That said, I think going back to our tasks, I think those kind of problems and learning regimes are tailored for image categorization, for pattern matching type of algorithms. When I think back about, Ullman and, the some of the point that Josh was just making about the visual routines and how we are able to compose and learn, on the fly, an infinite number of visual reasoning problems. It's very hard for me to imagine how we can kind of continue to scale up self-supervision and things of that sort to get to systems that will really learn, from a handful of training examples. I mean, maybe just to mention some of our own work, some of the work we've done as and related to inductive biases and recurrent neural networks. Our work a few years ago started building computational neuroscience models of classical and extra-classical receptor fields phenomena. Very well described in electrophysiology. The classical receptor field is the part of the visual field that if properly stimulated, will typically elicit a response from the neuron. The extra-classical receptor field is typically a region sitting right outside of the classical receptor field. By itself, if stimulated, it will not elicit a response, but if stimulated in combination with the classical receptor field, it will have a drastic effect on the neural response. And we're working on these circuits because we're interested in modeling and understanding visual illusions. Now, there's a prior work, both anatomical and electrophysiological, suggesting that recurrent connections, feedback connections, potentially observe some of these classical extra-classical receptor field interactions. So our work took us with very classical kind of computational neuroscience modeling, trying to model how neurons communicate within a cortical column and across cortical column. Now, this is very different from kind of standard CNNs that only communicate going, from lower stages of processing towards higher stages of processing, because here neurons are allowed to exchange information horizontally, or so within a processing stage, or from a high level stage onto a lower level stage. So we built those circuits and found that they were able, we could work with constraint from the anatomy and physiology and get models that would exhibit and explain most of these electrophysiology studies. And then if we literally simulate, kind of scale up these circuits into models that could process full field stimuli, they were consistent with a host of visual illusions. Things like color induction, the fact that our perception of a particular color patch is highly dependent on the context, or the tilt illusion, the fact that our perception of orientation is highly context dependent, similar effects in motion, stereo, et cetera, et cetera. And so anyway, without going too far off a tangent, where this work took us is perhaps to now wonder, why is it, if the visual system, why would it be that the visual system seems to be going into so much trouble through those recurrent circuits to implement strategies that seems to be flawed? After all, visual illusions are kind of edge cases where literally the visual system fails. The tilt illusion is a deviation.
Oops, you're muted. Thomas, you're muted.
No?
Already?
No, I can hear.
Oh, sorry. I guess my connection went out. Sorry.
Okay, sorry. So these visual illusions are kind of edge cases for our visual system. They are failure cases. And so why would it be that the visual system goes into so much trouble? And so our assumption has been that, of course, the visual system doesn't do anything by chance. And so perhaps many of these visual illusions are a byproduct of strategies to build and to solve object perception and object constancy, so that perhaps the same mechanisms that would yield color illusions would be responsible for our ability to solve color constancy, seeing colors irrespective of the illuminant. That maybe the tilt illusion would be a byproduct of strategies that are optimal for detecting edges in natural scenes, where there are all kinds of inductive biases that might actually help the system to solve those tasks. So anyway, going back to the question, what I think is, I think this was one of the questions, how to discover those inductive biases. I think neuroscience at the mechanism level might be able to, and electrophysiology might be able to allow us to decipher maybe basic mechanisms that will be able to help us solve more complex visual tasks, solving much more efficiently with fewer training examples, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think so. Do we think we've covered most of the ground on the evolution side? I mean, there's a lot to it.
Yeah.
Again,
sorry.
Yeah.
So maybe if I was not clear, the idea of evolution is that perhaps neurophysiology might not tell us necessarily something about evolution, but the mechanisms that are at play could be deciphered by neurophysiology, and in turn be translated to deep neural networks.
And I think, I mean, I think the kind of study that Nancy was talking about, that Katerina did with showing that a deep network kind of spontaneously develops a face and object, that could as much be a model of what happened in evolution, right? As in what happens in biological learning, especially given some of the evidence that some of that stuff is in there in very young babies' brains, but it could still be compatible with that, right? Yeah. So I think it's also another challenge, but really interesting open work area, I think, is that if you want to make artificial evolution and learn about where inductive biases come from and how might intelligence arise from nothing, there's a sense in which deep learning and networks and deep RL is kind of like evolution, but there are some important differences. The mechanisms of evolution involve, in some ways, much deeper kinds of structural modification, right? Like most ways of training a neural network don't change the fundamental architecture that much. Like you have the kind of result Nancy cited, where you have one big network and it kind of carves out two channels through it. But that's different than introducing recurrence, or introducing 100 new layers, or introducing a self-attention mechanism, or any number, or a memory buffer, or any number of other things that evolution might have introduced into brains.
Yes.
But let me just finish this thought, which in AI, those things are always introduced through cultural evolution, if you like. Like human researchers say, oh, I wonder if I could do this. What about this? We don't have algorithms that do that. And they involve, that's partly because they involve actually writing code. Humans have to come up with the idea, and then they have to write new code. And we don't have the kind of algorithms that are used for artificial evolution, even things that are sometimes called neural architecture search. They basically search within a set of existing kind of architecture motifs, turn switches on and off. They don't fundamentally write new code. But for human and for biology, it's all about code. The code starts with your DNA, and then how that's interpreted and executed through the course of development and all throughout your life. And evolution can modify all those different chunks of code that give it a much richer space. I mean, almost a universal space to be able to explore. So I think if we want to pursue AI simulated evolution, we're going to have to be pursuing approaches that are much more able to like kind of write new code basically than just explore the weight space of existing architectures.
Okay, yeah. I think that's super interesting, and I don't write code, so I don't know, but it seems to me that, you know, I write papers, and and often what you do is you don't just start from scratch, invent something new, you copy and paste and edit, right? And I'm guessing coders do a lot of that too. And I think that is one of the main mechanisms of evolution. So yes, evolution does invent cool, new, qualitatively different things.
Oh yeah.
But most biologists think that the way it does that is to copy, paste, and differentiate as one of the very basic mechanisms. So it could be the actual mechanisms of evolution are not, you know, they're not the same as just training a network and changing the weights, but there may be a relatively small space of ways to twiddle with things involved.
Oh, there may be and no, I mean the analogs between what evolution does and what coding does are very rich. So that is certainly one of the mechanisms by which new code is written and new code in biology is written. Another one is that a lot of coding is actually writing programming languages, right? You write a new programming language in which you can then write other things much more quickly. And biology does that too, right? You could say, I mean, I'm not an expert by any means. I'm sure others out on this call are much more experts. But you know, my understanding is that, for example, a lot of evolution in mammals and other species of, you know, complex organismal life happens not by like actually making new genes, but sort of turning on the switches of gene regulation.
It's all regulation. It's all regulation.
Exactly. Yeah. So you could think of that as evolution basically created a new language in which evolution itself is much more efficient. It's kind of like we talk about learning to learn sometimes. It's like evolution evolves to evolve more effectively. And that's an analog of like how in programming you have a low-level language and then you write a high-level language. Like humans don't write in machine code, and evolution doesn't work in machine code either. Machine code is DNA. Evolution created these high-level languages with primitives that then gene regulation switches on off, which is like a human writing in, you know, Python, right? So there are lots of analogs, I think, and there's a really interesting space of AI techniques that have yet to be really connected with neuroscience that involve really algorithms for writing code, exploring the space of code, which includes copy, paste, modify, which includes write new languages and then write code within those. And I think those will be increasingly interesting to bring into contact with the biological side. So Dario DeMattis Reyes says, what are your thoughts about the existence of a backpropagation-like or any optimization principle such as gradient descent in cortex? Could that be possible?
No. So I was going to say, you know, I trained with Tommy Poggio at MIT, and Tommy was a close friend of Francis Crick, who wrote this very well-cited and known paper in Nature in the 80s, criticizing backpropagation and neural networks, saying there's no way on hell that this thing will ever be implemented in brains. I think by today's standard, there's probably at least 3 dozen papers describing ways to implement backprop, various approximations of backprop in brains. So I think, you know, there is.
Is there any evidence that any of those are actually right?
I think there is no, but I think, you know, to be honest, we know so little about the underlying learning. We know a lot about plasticity in the brains. We know very little about underlying learning rules. And so I think, you know, all of this, many of those implementations are fair game. Not to say that, you know, the brain necessarily does gradient descent, but you know, I think there is no reason why it could not, if that's indeed the best game in town.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, Nancy, the self-supervised learning you were talking about, I don't know if that's really an alternative to backpropagation or not. I mean, in some ways,
I think it still uses backprop, doesn't it?
They still use backprop, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't have to use the same kind of labels, but so the error is a more plausible form of error.
Yeah.
But
the updating mechanism is
still global.
Yeah.
Like Thomas, I think it seems like it makes sense that the brain should have something like backprop or some kind of optimization. But it is interesting that we haven't really found it too much. I mean, we have local Hebbian learning rules, which can implement some of the local kinds of things that backprop needs, but the idea that you can really backpropagate errors through an arbitrary network over long ranges, there hasn't been much evidence of that I know of. I think
but
it's
it'd be
another,
very hard to find, right? I mean,
well,
what would the tool be? You know, you have to calculate some error up here and propagate it down and change this. You know,
you
this
could set up.
I mean,
so Andrew Sachs, for example, has some ideas about how to do this, and you could set up cases where, for a certain kind of network, maybe for a not terribly deep network, under certain situations, like the main error signal would kind of be in one layer or another layer. So one of the things that backprop does is it doesn't just allocate error or sort of error signals and tell you where to update synapse by synapse. I mean, it does do that, but for certain kinds of controlled situations in relatively simple networks, it will say, well, you should change. Mostly, you're going to change the last layer or the first layer or some intermediate layer. And that would be a way to test backprop type ideas if you could set up those situations biologically, because then you could go and test for whether plasticity tended to happen in this part of the brain or this part, for example. So like you could set up some problems in vision for which backprop might predict the plasticity should happen primarily in early visual cortex, middle, or late. And Andrew Sachs, whose ideas I'm channeling, I think he has some ideas along these lines. I'm not sure. He was part of CBMM in the early days, and I think he's now a professor in Oxford. Is that right? I haven't been in touch with him recently, but his work would be interesting to check out in that direction.
Just to be clear, Josh, there's a lot of proposals. I mean, prediction networks are another. You know, you can explicitly have neural network that encode and pass error locally anyway. That
you mean like a PredNet
gazillions
thing?
Of ways.
Yeah. No. I'm not citing his work as I'm citing his work as an example of trying to propose realistic ways you could test these models. But I'm sure there are other proposals for that too. But yeah.
Okay, sure.
Should we take one more?
Or
question?
Well, depending on how quickly we answer them, we can take.
or many. All right. Okay, I was going to go on to this question from Quan Wan.
Yes.
Who says, to be completely hypothetical, is it possible the computational problems we're trying to solve, are different than what the brain is trying to solve? Say when we search for the neural substrates of face recognition, language processing, or intuitive physics separately. I don't know who would do that. Just kidding. That's what I do. Is it possible that the brain is actually using different computations for the same problem of ours, or use the same computations for disparate cognitive problems? Well, yeah, I think that absolutely. I mean, I think when I started off saying, I think we're starting to get methods to empirically test the degree to which the brain is engaging similar computations to whatever model is doing. And that's exciting and cool and fun and engaging, right? And so then we can ask empirically, are they similar? But as for the question of whether the tasks that we're looking for in the brain are different than the tasks that we're modeling with AI, I think that's just a point where we need to be clear about what we're doing, right? Like we need to just, not just say face perception. We just say, okay, what exactly is the face task we're talking about before we go comparing them to AI models.
To add to Nancy's point, I would say, I think you're asking whether it's different computations for the same problems or same computation for different problems. I would say there's no question that we're solving different problems. I think if there's one thing, I studied image categorization since I was a graduate student, and I'm deeply convinced that there is nothing that is ecologically valid about image categorization. That's the last thing our brain does, is categorizing images frame by frame. And I think if there's something that neuroscience has been teaching us in the past, 5-6 years, all the rodent work, beautiful rodent work that has done, and kind of all brain imaging of rodents, literally you can record in the visual cortex, and in almost any kind of task, you find a marked effects and measure of behavior all the way down to the lower areas of the visual cortex, which to me suggests that, we are not, our brains do not solve image categorization. We are involved in everyday tasks, whether it's looking for food, whether it's navigating to a point, so behavior will impact that goal, that cognitive problem will impact, the entire brain. And, obviously, I think the way we've been carving out those problems is, to be honest, mostly for convenience. I think this has been to a large extent guided by AI, computer vision, because those are problems that are easily measurable. We can measure progress in image categorization because it's easy to get class labels for images and figure out how well we are doing at that task. And so I think, a lot of it has been convenience, and I think very little of it actually is necessarily too closely related to the kinds of cognitive tasks and problems that our brains are solving on a daily basis.
I think this is a place where, again, the cognitive science part of brain science, the people who study behavior and models and algorithms at the software level, have often been in a good position to provide guidance for both the neuroscience and the machine learning people. Or at least personally, as someone who specializes in that, that's one of the main things that neuroscience people and AI people come to me for, is they want guidance on what tasks should we be trying to solve. I just think cognitive science has really specialized for many decades in trying to really identify like what are the core tasks, and it's not like everybody's agreed on that. But I think by studying behavior and by trying to come up with models that can explain many different kinds of behaviors and figure out what are the core tasks that identify that kind of method has been very valuable and has helped us. Like, we don't know, quote, what are the core tasks that the brain solves, but we've made progress on that, and it's often come from cognitive science methods. And maybe you'll see some of that in Nancy's talks, because Nancy, in her work in brain imaging, as well as students and collaborators of hers, like Ev Fedorenko in language, or Rebecca Sachs in social cognitive neuroscience, and many others, that's kind of the approach that they've developed, is to try to use a combination of behavioral methods and classic cognitive psychology to try to figure out how to sort of jointly understand the tasks and the brain systems that fit together. So I think that is interesting to explore.
Yeah, and another parallel field, just to say, another parallel field that does that very effectively is to just look at development and say, what are the core cognitive abilities that are present very early? And that's another way to kind of figure out what are the tasks that are really central
that's
to
definitely,
human cognition.
And right, I'll talk more about that in my talk, and I'm sure there'll be others on that. But to me, I'm especially influenced, and here I'm channeling insights of Nancy's as well as Liz Spelke and others in CBMM, is like when you find some kind of task that is both early emerging in babies, in infants, and seems to be like present very early on, some competence, some ability to do something, and it's supported by a dedicated brain system, so it seems, or at least when you can study in adults, and maybe even increasingly now in babies, and see, yes, there's a part of the brain that seems to do that. And you also have analogs or homologs in other species, then that seems like it's telling you something like, that's a fundamental thing, right?
Totally.
So,
totally.
And some of those, like face recognition, intuitive physics, language processing are all examples of those, but sort of different, right? Because language processing is one that isn't shared with other animals and is dependent on culture and experience, even though remarkably it does, when anybody who learns language tends to come out in basically exactly the same interesting network in the brain. So there is, I think, a great deal to be learned from the combination of development, brain, behavioral studies, and how and when those, and comparative studies across species, when and how those converge on some kind of decomposition of systems that's telling us something.
Yep.
If it's okay with others, can we go to there's one
There's
more
a good
question
one.
that's the next highly ranked, which it's very good, and it's also actively spawned a whole sub discussion. So probably everybody's been following that, but the gist of it is, why is there no theoretical neuroscience in the brain like the way there is theoretical physics in physics? Do we have to rely on experimental methods or neuroanatomy? And then Miguel says, that was Laha Ale, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but Laha says that. Miguel says there is theoretical neuroscience, cites the book by Diane and Abbott. Laha and others say, well, but has it really had impact? Varun Wadia says, well, I think the claim is that there isn't, quote, theory in the same way there is in physics. For example, we don't have laws of the brain in the same way we have laws of motion or electromagnetism. Essentially, physicists build a theoretical framework, and then all experiment is to test the predictions, LIGO to find gravitational waves and so on, many years after they were predicted. In neuroscience, we seem to do experiments first and then try to stitch it together, and there's more and more debate. But I think I would add into this that there's also on AI, like at different points in time, neuroscience has been more driven by sort of proposals for grand laws and then experiments to test them. And right now, maybe it seems more in experimental phase, but AI also has kind of gone back and forth between, you know, I mean, especially a lot of the neural network research, it doesn't seem very theory driven. And yet in other parts of the field or in other times, like several people here have cited Tommy Pojo's work, and, you know, he's the founding director of CBMM. I'm sure you're all familiar with his work and you've even seen him talk. You know, he's definitely been an advocate for theory in both machine learning, AI, and in the brain. So there's definitely all of that, but it's, yeah, we should comment on, like, what do we make of either the current moment or the longer sweep of the field in terms of the right role that theory is playing or should play?
I mean, there's a huge role of theories, but maybe not a big overarching theory like you have in physics, right? So, you know, it's a more complicated system, right? You know, you don't, well, I guess I was gonna say you don't have broad overarching theories in biology either, but you have evolution. And that accounts for a lot. And maybe there's a bit of an analog in terms of, you know, I don't know, optimized computation or something like that, right? If there's something really, you know, most exciting to me about the use of deep nets is it's a way to say, you know, can we use them to figure out what would an optimized system do, right? So it's like we used to do.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that there's a broad theoretical idea which includes deep networks, but it also includes like all of
ideal
the Bayesian
observer
things.
models, and
and Friston and kind of almost everybody. I mean, like, which basically it's sort of the kind of engineering optimization toolkit. It says, and you know, it includes like expected utility theory and information theory, a set of tools on, you know, I guess to me it's maybe the overwhelming, if I were to say the single big idea is something like expected utility theory, honestly, some idea that there's like a cost function or a loss function or utility function, and then there's some probabilities on how the world can shake out and how your actions can play out. And you're trying to optimize, you know, intelligent behavior is trying to optimize for good expected utility outcomes, maybe to try to maximize for those or something like that. And it could do that in many different ways. And it wants to do it on not just, you know, it wants to do it in the future, like expected utility into the future, because it doesn't really matter about the past. What matters is you know, your whole life. That's one way to put a broad theoretical idea that has been, you know, continually influential in the field, and just kind of takes different guises. When you train a neural network with backprop to minimize a squared error loss, that's one version of it. If you make a hierarchical Bayesian model, that's another version of it. A reinforcement learning model is another version of it.
And broadly, those approaches can do what I think is one of the most exciting things, and that is, in principle, sometimes they can answer why questions. Like, why do we solve this task this way? Why is the brain organized that way? Right? So if you use any of these optimizing systems and you find that an optimized system has these properties, and then you find those properties in the brain, then that's pretty damn cool. It tells you, okay, maybe we're starting to understand why the brain does that. That's what an optimized system would do, right?
It can answer why in a way that also feels general and explanatory. Because sometimes the answer is, well, just because, right? I mean, there are some things like, you know, like, for example, biology is full of famous examples of things that it doesn't seem like any optimized system would do, like, you know, have the retina turned inside out or whatever it is. But, you know, maybe someone could come up with an optimization explanation. But yeah, but when you explain something in terms of that kind of, you know, optimization account, then it often feels like it's going, oh, that's going to then have lots of other predictions, or it's going to unify with other things, because that same principle is probably, you know, important in other settings. I don't know if the people who were engaging in that debate, does this get to what you were
in neuroscience is messier than physics, arguably.
Yeah, and attempts to make it as clean as physics are not honestly all that satisfying to many people. So Carl Friston has pretty prominently basically tried to take some ideas from physics, you know, in terms of like the free energy principle, which is another version of the same idea we're talking about, but explicitly framed in theoretical physics terms. And it's elegant and inspiring in many ways, and also, like, you know, doesn't necessarily really tell us anything specifically about how the brain does. I mean, Carl himself said the same theory applies to slime molds and the universe and brains. And so it's, you know, it's a very general theory, but it's not necessarily telling us anything specifically about brains or anything like the kind of flexible adaptive intelligence that characterizes humans and some other animals, but not slime molds and the universe. So, you know, in the quest for super grand theory, sometimes you lose what we're most interested in. But that's why I feel like the kind of theory that we were talking about, as Nancy was calling this sort of, it's sort of optimization, taking into account probabilities and utilities, really, that is sort of as close as we come to a standard model or standard theoretical paradigm. And then we explore it in different ways, depending on the kind of aspect of behavior that we're studying, and whether we're more, you know, working at the neural circuit level or more at the behavioral level and so on. Or the time scale. Are we looking at, you know, perception in the moment or learning over a lifetime? The same math can apply in all those different settings, but the particular computational toolkit by which you explore that math might be best suited differently in the different cases.